Welcome to The Constant, where the only constant is change. We're going to swim in the deep blue of business technology and culture. A couple of housekeeping matters. All the opinions expressed on this podcast are the opinions of the participants in this podcast. They don't represent opinions of their employers, partners, or clients. Sometimes at The Constant, we also show third-party videos. They are freely available in public domains such as YouTube and do not represent proprietary content that we show here, potentially without the consent of the producers of that content. Today's episode is a deep dive into Silicon Valley. Well, Silicon Valley is not as much of a sea, as a valley, but still it has its own secret sauce, that we want to understand, for which, we would need to go a little bit into history, a little bit into current affairs, to look, at the region from the cultural, economic, financial standpoints, because we really want to understand, what defines Silicon Valley, as a place where innovation happens. Why does it have that gift, that keeps on giving? And is it possible to recreate its successful functioning elsewhere outside of Silicon Valley? What are some of the examples of those kind of migrations of Silicon Valley ideas and principles and ways over to different categories and different geographic areas? So that's what we want to talk about today. And I am with my esteemed co-host from Riyadh, Juan Napoli, or JP, who the listeners and viewers already know very well, who's brought a lot of new perspectives, to this podcast, and really running very strongly in the AI world. It's bringing a lot of new things, new thinking, into the podcast and elsewhere, of course. And we also have today a much anticipated guest from San Francisco, California, Victoria Mensch. Victoria holds a PhD in psychology. She had a successful corporate career before switching to entrepreneurship and running Silicon Valley Innovation Center, and now Silicon Valley Executive Academy. So Victoria is one of the power women of Silicon Valley, and it's a great honor, to have Victoria today here on this podcast. Welcome.
Thank you very much, German. Yes, excited to be here.
Victoria, could you tell us a little bit about what your current interests are? And what are you running? What are you doing? What occupies, your days?
Well, it's a lot of things, but I want to talk about Silicon Valley Executive Academy, obviously. So what we do at the Academy, we have programs that allow executives, companies, corporations, founders to tap into Silicon Valley Innovation Playbook. So immersive experiences, mostly here in Silicon Valley, through experience-based knowledge sharing. And we'll also couple this with the burnout-proof leadership skills so that leaders can have the innovation effort the way implemented with confidence, with sustainability, and also being able to be resilient in the age of disruption, including AI disruption.
That's very interesting because you're touching on an important issue of the connection between the success of an individual and the success of a company. So personal growth, versus economic growth. Just like companies, we go through difficult times, we also go through times of success. And that's why, this episode is very important because it will contain, small pieces of advice and cues for people, not only what makes Silicon Valley companies successful, but what can make you successful as well, to model and mimic, the success of the founders of those companies. The significance of Silicon Valley outside of the US is hard to overestimate. And JP, Juan, please, so what are your thoughts? You're looking at Silicon Valley out of Riyadh. You've been to Silicon Valley, you've been to the US multiple times, but what does Silicon Valley look like, from outside of the US?
Thank you so much, Herman. And Victoria, welcome to the podcast here and the Constant. I'm so excited to be able to talk to you about Silicon Valley, right? And Silicon Valley similar environments here in the region. What it looks like from up here is obviously a place where things are happening, right? We get to consume most of the products coming from companies that are born, out of this Silicon Valley ecosystem. But at the same time, there are many different types of companies that are just operating in the US or in the US and Europe. And what I have noticed is copies of those companies are being built locally to support the local ecosystem, to be customized to the local needs, the local language, the local culture, right? And that is driving kind of a ripple effect around the world, where innovation happens in one place, the new ideas and the structure of the company, the business model, and then that is just being adopted around the world. I come originally from Argentina, so I have seen this from different angles. South America, copying some of the innovations We have something called Mercado Libre in Argentina, which is very similar to Amazon in the US. And I have seen that as well in Eastern Europe. Right, I was living in Bulgaria for 2 years, Slovakia for 3 years, and I have seen similar organizations repeating that similar approach. And now here in Saudi Arabia, one of the things that strike me is these food companies, right, where they have the structure of the drivers, the orders, the app that just understands you and just customize the alerts and the offers to your needs. And they're really effective, right? As effective as the apps that I have seen in the US when I was living in New York. So what I will say is Silicon Valley, innovation happens in one place, but then the implementation happens everywhere, right? Which is very interesting. Now, obviously, there is always a driving factor to imitate that similar environment. So innovation can also happen here. And I have seen some examples where some companies are actually starting to bring their businesses to US, innovation in terms of delivery of services or integration capabilities, because there is a capacity to have cheaper and faster and easier products here or in other places outside the US, but sometimes in the US, because regulation and the cost in many cases will be cheaper. So what I will say is it is very interesting to see this kind of symbiosis between the innovation in the US and the effect that happens in other countries around the world. So
Right. So I mentioned in my introduction for the academy that we help to tap into Silicon Valley Innovation Playbook, but it actually assumes that there is a playbook. And I think that's the premise of it, that there are some consistent strategies, techniques, methods, pieces of infrastructure that help produce innovation in a predictable way, right? So however controversial it sounds that there's innovation in a predictable way, I think the difference here is that how do you sustainably compete on innovation, right? So that's what we can learn from Silicon Valley. And it doesn't mean that these techniques and methods and playbook cannot be replicated elsewhere. It's really that consistency in producing that innovation and turning ideas to businesses that distinguishes to this day Silicon Valley from the rest of the world.
Interesting. Yeah, but what I've been always fascinated about Silicon Valley is that there is a mythology of Silicon Valley. Because we currently look at Silicon Valley as really this fountain of innovation. So the only thing that's constant in Silicon Valley, just like on this podcast, is change. Because we had an era of semiconductors, then we had informational evolution. So now we're going in through the artificial intelligence spur. Everything is constantly changing and gets upgraded, and there is no end in sight. But at the very same time, as a place, as a cultural place, Silicon Valley was born in a garage in 1938, when Bill Hewlett and David Parker, got their first little contract, with Disney and started a firm, inside their garage. And since then, it's really been something that stayed constant too. So not just change, but those small beginnings, really low beginnings for very successful founders who managed, not only to apply the secret sauce of Silicon Valley, but also scale beyond Silicon Valley into becoming global companies, it stayed the same. So like Airbnb, obviously, right? So it's all started, with little mattresses that people started renting to each other. So this garage, there's something small, is very important for the mythology of Silicon Valley. And then Silicon Valley started getting into prominence in the 90s in the midst of the Cold War, when the military-industrial complex in the U.S., discovered the potential for Silicon Valley to become big. And Victoria will be talking about this bias toward action, and that's something that, to me, maybe encapsulates next to the garage, that spirit of Silicon Valley. So, Victoria, so what are your thoughts? Bias toward action would be one. Please talk about it. What are some of the other components of that secret sauce?
I always talk when I think about Silicon Valley, we want to think about an ecosystem, right? So yes, it is a place in geography, and it's not a small place. It's actually a very big place. A lot of people don't understand that as well. So you can envision it's a really vast area along the San Francisco Bay. So it's not just the center somewhere. But it actually, what it managed to do is to build an ecosystem. And German, you're absolutely right. A lot of it is really rooted in history. So one big part of that history is Stanford University. So before that was established, I read somewhere that the only reason to visit this place that we call Silicon Valley now was if you really like prunes, because there's only orchids here with plums and apples, right? And then, Will Stanford decided to establish the university, and the first president of the university saw that people would come from East Coast and they get their engineering degree, and then they would leave. They would leave back to East Coast and they would leave to work in Bell Labs and what have you. So he thought, how can I keep them here? Because there is nothing that the Valley actually can offer. So that's how the support for entrepreneurship started, with those little brands, including Hewlett and Packard, right, that established this. So really think about this as the ecosystem, where Stanford really could not, as a university, could not replicate the whole ecosystem, just support some parts of it. So they came together as that ecosystem. Now, I think that the fact that semiconductor industry came on board actually what really made this whole history of Silicon Valley come to play as well. Because if you look at the semiconductor industry, it's very capital intensive and it's very labor intensive and resource intensive. So that the emergence of venture capital was really driven by that, right? How do you support the industry like this that really needs that upfront investment of a lot of money with no sure return of that money? So that helped to build the semiconductor industry. And now we're looking at all those different ways of technologies that can do that. So technology is a big part of Silicon Valley. And then all other pieces of the infrastructure came together at the universities, venture capital, entrepreneurs, people started to be attracted to that entrepreneurial spirit. The companies that were built here started here, they ended up here providing employment. And so that's really this ecosystem that we're talking about, that element of success of this particular place. So one of the things that we want to talk about is that density, physical density of everything that has been accumulated at this piece of land, right? So where the ideas that come in the conversations next to the garage or in the study room at the university, Stanford, Berkeley, Santa Clara, what have you, they have the support of incubators, accelerators, investors, their professors, their lawyers really come to play and become a business right away quite quickly, or fail quite quickly.
Interesting. What are your thoughts, Juan? Does it make sense from the kind of global outside of the U.S. standpoint?
Definitely, I think that's the right mix, right? So you have all of the pieces to ensure that an idea can be quickly put into practice, and you can have that boom moment where the blitz scale into a global company, and the understanding of what are the things it takes to take all those steps, because of this history of success, and there are people ready and hungry to help you along the way. Like you said, lawyers, you say academicians, like you said, technology is there, like I said, all of the talent is available, and at the same time, the help from a business perspective and so on. And it created also a brand, right? So companies coming out from that particular place are more trusted because they have all the backing, they have that kind of lessons learned. So therefore, copying that is hard because you cannot copy 20 years or 100 years, as you said, of history. And you can build something similar, and you can start to build your own reputation, and potentially locally, people will start to trust you because you can have maybe the right partners. But eventually, to build that dynamic ecosystem, it will take years as well. And not everyone has started at the same time. And even new initiatives that has begun a decade ago still need more maturity to get to that level. And as the ecosystem continues to improve and evolve, I think it's going to be very hard to really compete with that history. I was in Stanford University and kind of in Silicon Valley last year. I'm planning to travel again in November. And what I noticed is that vibrant ecosystem. We just talk to people about CEOs about, can we get together? And I will expect, some sort of, office meeting or, getting together into a particular place. No, we just get together in a coffee shop. And in the same way you're talking about a business opportunity or a company idea and so on, 3 or 4 people are around you doing something very similar, right? And some people even turn around and talk to, the person that is discussing the idea and just comes and adds more to that conversation, is seen as a positive thing. It's like that's just normal behavior in that environment, right? So I think that kind of mentality that everyone is looking for a business opportunity, whatever you can contribute, just bring it to the table, and it's going to be welcome and it's going to be invited. It's hard to replicate because not every culture is like that, right? And therefore we may have to build different types of Silicon Valley in different parts of the world that are matching the speed and the need of those particular regions. Here, for example, in the Middle East, people are more they are prefer to first make a personal relationship before they do a business relationship, right? But what I noticed in Silicon Valley is like it's all about business. So if you're gonna come to me, come with something business ready, come with some ideas, let's move fast, right? But here it's the opposite. It's like, okay, you want to do business with me, I need to just validate that you're a good person first, or someone that I can just have a good conversation first. If we click from the get go, then let's discuss business afterwards, right? And it's a kind of a different way of doing business, but eventually can have its benefits as well because people are connected at the personal level. They're more willing to tolerate failures and to be together for the long run. So it make build businesses that are more sustainable than maybe those that are just built because the business made sense when they got together, right? So just things to throw out there in terms of what I think.
Exactly, Juan. So maybe not everything needs to be replicated, right? Speaking of, burnout proof leadership skills. So that's exactly an element that Silicon Valley could benefit from business. So success is not just financial success. It's not just your career success, but there's also other elements of that come into harmony with your personal ecosystem, right? That is deeper relationship, for example. So that certainly has value in what you described. But I think the other element that I also wanted to highlight is when we talk about innovation, I think you spoke about that as well. Openness is a very important factor. Innovation ecosystem is not a closed ecosystem. It's very hard to come up with any new ideas when you are within yourself, whether it's a closed organization, behind closed doors, without collaboration, not only within the company, but within the companies and within the people. So the serendipity of those discussions, the openness of those discussions, the cross-pollinations of ideas from different industries, from different point of views, from different backgrounds and different experiences, that what actually makes the innovation, that replication of the production of new ideas possible.
What role, I wonder, risk tolerance plays in this combination? Because a lot of times, from personal experience, from observing how our organizations operate outside of the Silicon Valley, low risk tolerance can explain a lot of the slowness, and a lot of the hesitance, that companies have around innovation. Networks are okay, so there are a lot of places around the world where there are networks. You take any big educational regions, you take Austin, had its own kind of good days, lately, with the startup scenery, would you take obviously New York, Boston, a lot of different places within the US, that have this network, and there are all these professionals coming out of those. But what I think, has been missing, or maybe missing, from some of the other places, is the risk tolerance. And I know Victoria also spent quite a bit of time with your work with Silicon Valley leaders, understanding, that secret sauce. What is your take on risk tolerance? Is it critical? And is it critical for individual harmony? You started talking about that. And is it critical for a company's harmony going forward?
So innovation is unpredictable. So one of the things that we know about unknown is that it's going to remain unknown, right? So we know that we don't know something, and we don't know what it is that we don't know. So it's the exploration, going forward, and those paths that could lead to success or may not lead to success. That's the definition of innovation process, right? So you have to allow for some of those pathways that may end up with that end. So I think that in Silicon Valley, there is definitely high tolerance for failure. What other parts of the world would be called failure, here would be called, we learned a lesson, right? So that approach to failures, not as failures, but as that experiment that did not go well, and as the data point. So what can we learn from that? That's a very important distinction between the mindset of Silicon Valley and, quite frankly, most of the world, even in the US, there is a much more tolerance for risk taking in the Valley than in the rest of the country. There is a research that was done that said that the founders who started the company and failed have a better chance of receiving funding than the founders who never started the company. And the reason for that is that experience that you gain in the process. So even the fact that you started the company and it didn't go well for you already added to your experience, to your expertise that will allow you to succeed next time with a greater likelihood. So that's a very interesting mindset that you're prepared to put everything on the table, right? So you're prepared that the effort that you're putting forward may not lead to the results that you expected.
Interesting, because that's also made me think about day trading. We all know, this subculture of day trading where risk is clearly in a part of everyday's existence. And there is this beautiful book, by Tom Hugert, like originally a Danish investor who worked in London and then in the US, and now a very successful thought leader, in the day trading space. The best loser wins. So, and he strongly argued, that tolerance for loss is critical for the success, of a day trader. All successful day traders, they have a different psychology. That's what you alluded to, Victoria, when it comes to the startup culture. So you got to have that thick skin for failure. So you don't take failure, you don't take fiasco as an end of the world. No, you train your psychology to make it into the beginning of a world. And I think, Silicon Valley companies, both on the individual level of their founders and on the way, they operate as companies, they embed, that failure into everything. And it becomes, that fuel, that actually allows companies, to succeed, where others, only expect, good things to come. And when good things don't come, they have zero resistance, they have zero ability, to take that into and take advantage of that. And life, as we all know, is always made up, of good days and bad days. And people just only train themselves, and in a lot of places individually and as companies, to exist in a good time and to exist in a bad time, and actually even bake that those difficulties, into the way you operate as a company. I think, it may be one of those things, that would differentiate Silicon Valley. I guess, yeah, that's very, very, very interesting. You've done quite a bit of thinking, on we understand a little bit now the secret sauce of Silicon Valley, the garage mentality, this startup risk tolerance, the startup bias for action. But then, so what does it take, for those companies to become big? Because establishing yourself, yes, I mean, maybe 95% of startups, they fail and only 5% survive. But what does it take, for a startup such as Amazon, when it used to be a startup, to become actually a world empire? What is that? You've thought a lot about like scaling. So what are your thoughts on that? What have you found, that truly gives a good answer to this question?
Excellent. But that's a great topic. I recently was analyzing one of the top selling books on this space called Blitzscaling. I think it's a very famous book from Reid Hoffman. And one of the key things that they are talking about is companies go through these 5 different phases as they're growing big. Right? They're successful, they grow, and they have these different levels. And actually, we managed to get one video that maybe we can play it here from the co-author of the book, from Blitzscaling, that actually discusses in more detail what exactly is the orders of magnitude that the organization has to go through in terms of transformation as they become more successful, as they get more people in the organization, as they expand to different markets, as he expands to different countries, right? And his name is Chris Ye, and he's the co-author of the book Blitzscaling, again, authored by Reid Hoffman. And maybe we can play it up here, and then we can have a conversation about these particular concepts. Very interesting what he's saying.
Yes, yeah, let me play.
When you find a product that really fits the market and you have the growth engine of virality or distribution, you can grow at rates that seem utterly impossible. And a great example of this is the early days of PayPal. It took them a while to find the product market fit. And once they found that product market fit, things happened very quickly. And the company began growing at the rate of about 1 to 5% a day. 1 to 5% a day, it's growing like 10x per year. And that introduces a whole bunch of stresses into the equation. It's very hard to deal with. And so we always tell the entrepreneurs they need to anticipate, they need to understand what are the key transitions that you're going to go through. One of the biggest transitions that entrepreneurs face is when they go from being a tribe to a village. And the reason is you're going from an informal organization to a formal organization. That's where so many of these key transitions comes in. And you as a founder need to be ready for it. Now there's a whole bunch of them, but I'll mention a couple of the most important ones. The first is the transition between individual contributors to managers to executives. Now, the reason this one is very important is because as your company grows, you're going to have to build out a management hierarchy. There's no way to have a 1,000-person company where everyone just sort of reports to you, the founder. And so you need to start building out these layers. But there's a big transition when you start bringing in executives. When you have executives, they're actually managing managers. They're not working directly with the work. So how do you actually find executives who are effective? So understanding the nature of executive work and being able to successfully bring them in from outside the organization becomes one of the key lessons that blitzscaling founders have to learn. Second major transition is the transition between dialogue to broadcasting. What this means is when you are in a small company, very early on, you can just dialogue with your other employee. You have the personal touch and you can really convey your vision to everyone one-on-one. But when you have 1,000 employees, that's impossible. So you need to think about how you can broadcast your ideas. Somebody like Brian Chesky over at Airbnb, for example, writes an email every Sunday night to the entire company explaining what are some of the major issues he's thinking about. And that is a way to broadcast his vision, broadcast his ideas, and make sure everyone's on the same page. The final one that I always like to mention is the transition between pirate to Navy. When we think about pirates, like in Pirates of the Caribbean, and they're these wacky, that's kind of what a company is like early on in its history. It doesn't have anything to lose, so it can take a lot of chances. But as the company gets bigger and more successful, you have something to lose. It becomes important to go from being a pirate who's just risk-taking and making decisions on your own to becoming a Navy, where you actually have an admiral, you have captains, you have a whole structure, because you need to transition from being somebody who acts on impulse to somebody who carefully plans and figures out a strategy that other people can carry out.
Now,
Exactly. Yeah. So I will say that the summary of what he's saying is, and maybe this is one of the reasons, maybe we can just ask Victoria later on if this is true or not, but one of the reasons why many companies fail, right? Is it because you have these amazing entrepreneurs with great ideas, great passion, young people that are willing to just sleep on the on the avenue on top of their computers, day in, day out, just to get the product out there. Super excited about what they're doing, getting a lot of traction in the market, and they are really good at pushing something out there. But then when the product is successful, when you need to expand, when you need to make sure you beat the competition in different markets and people already know your product and they're able to replicate it, and you need to just make sure you're the first one in the market, that you take over the market. That's when most companies may fail because they don't have the discipline, the structure, the understanding of what it takes to delegate and to ensure that you have the right people for the right positions and you expand your organization to cover very important roles that are not initially essential, like maybe marketing and many other areas like operations and procurement and so on, that are really traditionally important for larger organizations. So I come from 19 years in IBM across different geographies, and I have seen the company being small with 50, 60 people, the company being big in many places, 10,000 people or 40,000 employees. And even that organization, that company, IBM in that particular country was playing differently, right? I remember being in the Middle East in Dubai when the company was just starting and we got like 500 employees and you can talk to everyone, have a problem with HR. You go to the same person in HR, you tell them your problems, you solve them and so on. I moved to the US. We were 10,000 people in New York or more. And then therefore you had to send an email and then that person may be in a different state. You have to wait until that person responds. It's potentially, take, weeks until you can solve your problems. And that's just normal. That's just, you have to just get accustomed to that. So and I think that's one of the key things that entrepreneurs need to understand, that they need to build the company to grow and they need to build themselves individually to grow as well and get as much training as they need to in the technical and in the business and startup piece, but also in how do they grow the company as well. And that's one of the areas where I think, in our region, especially in the Middle East, is a bit more tricky, right? Companies that are emerging are going to come from young people. They're just eager to do business and to bring something new. Others are more established. They already know what they need. The companies are already doing well. And then you have most of the businesses government, right? Again, well established, well defined, clear rules. So how do we entrepreneurs, how do young people, become sophisticated enterprise, executives? We need to bring that level of education here. We need to make sure people understand that too. And I think that's where Silicon Valley excels, because you have all the proximity to organizations like the one from Victoria that have been doing this for decades, Stanford University, Berkeley, which are driving that leadership education from the get-go. So people that are coming into the entrepreneurial space, they know that there is an easy way into this more executive layer, and they can attract a lot of people to come in and to play those roles, which may not be available so easily in our region. So these are key things that we need to look into as we're replicating the Silicon Valley success formula.
I want to say that you're absolutely right. The skills and the qualities that are required to start a company may not be the same that are required to grow a company and to manage a company. And Silicon Valley certainly has its share of failures and successes in this area. When the person who starts the company, the founders, they really run out of their zone of expertise and competency to actually execute on the growth of the company. And there are several ways how this can be accounted for, how it can be helped. So one of the ways actually to realize that me as a person, as a founder, I really like to start new things. I don't necessarily want to do the same thing over and over again once the company is on the track of success. So there is a personal choice in that as well. And I think what's important when I talk to founders, entrepreneurs, it's important to understand that you have that choice. You want to go inside yourself, look at your values, what you like to do, what you don't like to do, and be honest with yourself. Do you actually want to write an email to the entire company every Sunday? Or you want to build new things? You want to have something out of nothing? You want to burn the midnight oil and so on and so forth, right? So it is a choice. There's a personal choice in that. And the choice is that I actually want to see my baby grow and graduate from college and build a successful career. Then there's an understanding that there's a certain set of skills that are required for that. And you may or may not want to acquire those skills. And if you don't want to acquire those skills, there is a support. You can bring a management team who will help you run the business. So the most famous one would be when Facebook brought the chief operating officer to help Mark to run the company. When Google did the same, when they brought Schmidt to help Larry and Sergey to run the company. So there are successful examples of that as well. Or there are successful examples of those founders who made the conscious choice to say, you know what, I'm ready to acquire those skills. I do have the qualities and I want to do this and I want to run this company and I want to see this through, and they became the CEO. Netflix is one of those. LinkedIn is one of those. Airbnb is another example that we saw in this video. So there are always different models that are available, but a lot of that is really to understand for the founder perspective what it is that you want. What's your definition of success for the company and for yourself, your personal success.
Interesting. Yeah, by the way, I do want to show our viewers, the book, that Juan has been talking about. So Blitz Scaling by Rick Hoffman and Chris Ye. So, and what I found, this book, is full of different insights and delights. But one thought that I picked up, made me pause and made me think for quite a while about it. So they mentioned, that maybe this phenomenon Silicon Valley is not in its ability, to generate something out of its own area, out of its own ecosystem, but its ability to take advantage, of what's going on in the bigger world, so that they're better than anybody else at harnessing that spirit of constant change that we're going through. Just look, guys, there's one example that's not from this book, so in roughly in 2015 or 2017, the nations had an ambitious goal of creating around like 600 million jobs in the world, so that they can fulfill, their need, for for sustainable development globally. And 10 years down the road, the question is already not about creating jobs, 600 million jobs. The question is the opposite from it. So how can we, how are we going to keep those jobs, that are being devoured, by AI? So it's not that there is that linear process, that someone at the United Nations could 10 years ago say, like, okay, I see the future, and this future is 600 million jobs. No, it's not the case. It's we are being looked, from the future by something, that constantly changing the rules of the game on us. It's playing like we're playing a game of chess, with an unknown entity that's constantly changing. And Silicon Valley is capable of harnessing that change. And I think, there is some powerful insight in that relationship that Silicon Valley has with the global world. On the one hand, yes, we see like this element of a garage. Then there is this big scaling going on. We're thinking about how can we transplant some of the Silicon Valley principles elsewhere and build something like Silicon Valley in other places. But look what happened historically in those cases. We know people who grew up, in the former Soviet Union, just like such as myself or Victoria. So we all know the town of Zelenograd, that during the Soviet times was built at the outskirts of Moscow, and it was an imitation of Silicon Valley. It was that artificial town that was created for semiconductors to actually serve the purpose of winning in the Cold War. And for a while, it was quite a bit of a success because some of the Soviet scholars and engineers, mathematicians, and the former Soviet Union received tremendous, great education. They would come to Silicon Valley as visiting scholars. They would pick up those secrets. Sometimes, the KGB was involved, in pirating those secrets, but nobody was even hiding those secrets from them in Silicon Valley. So they would bring those secrets back into Zelenograd, and the Soviets would start developing them and building something. But by the time, they're going to build it, so Silicon Valley would already invent something else. So the speed, the speed of innovation, that dynamic that only comes through action, is very fascinating. And it's really hard to replicate. We go to another case study when Airbnb, when it was still small, faced the danger of being demolished in Europe, by Wimdu. There was a copycat of Airbnb in Europe, run by three German brothers who thought, that they have everything that they need in order to take on Airbnb. And so yes, they successfully replicated something, literally copied Airbnb in Europe. But then Airbnb decided, not to withdraw from competition, but in fact aggressively enter the European market and beat the German brothers, on their turf. So it means, so they engage with the global world, in such a way as allowed them to scale in such a fast fashion. And I think, Hoffman and Ye, so they talk about this example. So there is something that we need to be really curious about, to keep digging into that. What makes Silicon Valley so interesting? Is it something that's built inside on that among those 4 or 5 million people, who live there, or it is built, by a very small group of those 4 or 5 million people who have the open mind, to your point, Victoria, to the rest of the world, and they're capable of absorbing what's going on and where the world is going, and then, start putting some meat, onto those bones. So what are your thoughts, guys?
So this is exciting. One of the things that comes to mind is a study that I did recently in terms of where are the top companies or top startups coming from today? Because there may be a misconception, right? We think, oh my God, yes, Google, Microsoft, all these big companies are in Silicon Valley, and we can hear a lot of new companies coming from Silicon Valley still. But the reality, when I did some research recently, the top companies in the rank of AI top companies, startups that are just unicorns, have been invested, where people are investing billions or millions of dollars into, they're not necessarily coming from Silicon Valley. I've seen nowadays Lovable, right? It's one of the companies that are just everyone is moving into, because you can create apps by just type in some prompt and you can get the app without no coding and anything. It's from Sweden, right? So, and then I know these other similar companies coming from other parts of the world. So I did some research and I found out that surprisingly, US still, dominating maybe in the 30-40% range, but there is a huge diversity in terms of where those top AI companies are coming from. And I think this is a very interesting concept. If AI is be able to replicate most of the concepts that Victoria was saying are unique to Silicon Valley. The concept of law, the scaling, the executive mindset, making sure you have all of the different agents support you as you grow, and all of the other elements related to validating research work and getting done the marketing projects and so on for your company, all done through AI. Then maybe there are diminishing returns on just focusing on, I don't want my company to be born and raised in Silicon Valley, right? Because obviously it is expensive, right? It's very selective. There's a lot of challenges to be able to build a company out of there. But nowadays, you could build a company almost anywhere, right? As if you have the right tools, the right knowledge, and so on, and that company just goes live, and suddenly you have enough funds to dominate the ads space, and people start to click there and access your company, your products. You can really compete with almost anyone. So I think in the future, like you said, German, I feel like AI is going to create a new playing field for everyone that is working on the AI startup world, even not AI startup specifically, just companies that are being powered by AI that can actually come from anywhere. And even local companies or small solutions or technologies that people are going to be building to solve their problems. It's not anymore the case that you need to always get a product that is ready, right, and customize it to your needs, where you may be able to build whatever you need today in just a few minutes by prompting it to a computer. So there's a huge change happening in many different areas, and I think that's one of the areas where it's going to hit the most, the area of innovation, the area of coming with product into the market. And I was just talking to a company from Pakistan that they have bases in different parts of the world, and they were saying that they are building products with Lovable for different big players, top 500 organizations out of Pakistan, which is some of these no-code tools, and the development cycle has been reduced significantly, and these companies are extremely excited about the products that they're seeing coming out from these organizations. So it's going to be interesting to see what the next Silicon Valley looks like. Maybe it's going to be everywhere. Just that capacity that AI brings will just just really transform the need for collocated physical space where everyone has to come up with the right ideas.
I certainly agree with your thoughts on AI. AI is definitely a game changer. So if you think of Silicon Valley and its claim to fame, it's really technology, right? So that's where all of those things that we're talking about, innovation and ideas, they're really based in the development of technology. So we spoke in the beginning of the podcast about semiconductors and why that was so critical. The semiconductor industry brought this, phenomena of Silicon Valley ecosystem took place: capital intensive, resource intensive, intellectual capital intensive, right? So all those kind of came together and brought the Silicon Valley as a phenomenon to this world, right? Now, what artificial intelligence does, if you look at the fundamentals of the technology of artificial intelligence, it was born here and it's being developed here to new, new heights over and over and over again as a technology. Now, what AI does is certainly democratize that use of technology. So you don't need to be a coder anymore. You don't need to have a PhD in electrical engineering anymore. You don't need to have millions and millions of dollars from venture capital anymore, right? All you need is really your ideas and your ideas that are around you, maybe. That's why there's so many local businesses that are so geared toward the needs of this local kind of a culture and circumstances and conditions. And there are all those entrepreneurial people who are really taking this into the players. So, oh, finally. So that's why so many people who with humanities background as myself, like, oh, finally, I can talk to the technology in the language that it understands, right? I'm in love with Lovable. So, my God, finally, somebody actually can implement my ideas without intermediaries. So from that perspective, AI implementation, application of AI, definitely democratizing this market of technology innovations, right, and applications in so many different areas. The fundamentals of the technology, if you think of it, the form, if you wish, the platform of that natural language modeling, generative AI, and all the advancement that we were talking about, quantum computing that we were starting to talk about as if it already happened. But all of this really requires that infrastructure that we've discussed.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So what that made me think, if technology is what defines Silicon Valley, that's one story. But so far we've been talking about qualities that define Silicon Valley, not in technological terms, but more like in human terms. Risk tolerance, bias for action, ecosystems. So these are things, that have nothing to do, at least at face value, with technology. And I'll give you an example. So when I worked for Crispin Porter and Bogotsky, which was one of the fastest growing, most successful advertising agencies nationally in the early 2000s, so they were named Agency of the Year, a dozen of times, by all the major trade press in the U.S. So Crispin Porter and Bogotsky, also led by people who were surprisingly interested and adept in extreme sports, from dirt biking, to kayaking, to backpacking, to skiing, to everything. So they possessed, that risk tolerance, inside of them. So it was in the DNA of the company. It operated in a completely different category. It had nothing to do with technology. It was advertising. Obviously, some technology, digital, was being part of everything that advertising was doing at that time. But it was not about inventing new technology. It was about inventing new creative ideas for to push brands. And the founders of the company, Alex Bogovsky and others, so they consciously encouraged everybody to imitate Silicon Valley, not in terms of let's bring technology in, but let's have a bias for action. So we didn't talk at that time in those terms, but very similar terms. Let's have high risk tolerance. Let's be collaborative. Let's be creative. Let's think outside of the box. Let's be open minded. So those principles got replicated, and it really drove the success of that company forward. I remember, how everybody in the company adopted more of the kind of Steve Jobs, way of dressing, even maybe turtlenecks, but anything, no neckties. So the old persona of an American madman from Mad Men, the TV series, uh, with neckties, and suits, and all of those stuffy rooms when people were making deals, with a lot of paper money. So it was all gone. It was all a Silicon Valley in the middle of Miami, in the middle of Colorado, in New York, where people were trying, to build and recreate that culture on the human level, not technology per se. So it's just interesting to me. It's so obvious, and I'm completely compelled by what you just said, Victoria, that say AI specifically originated in Silicon Valley. Yes, the semiconductors physically originated in Silicon Valley. But at the same time, what drives Silicon Valley as a culture is not technology, because even now AI, like you said, it makes everybody a coder in a sense, or you don't need technology anymore. Let's assume, that beautiful world that's going to come in the next 10 years, that the technology is going to disappear, because it's all going to be like giving us the goods that we want, but it's going to be at the background. It's not going to be us, fighting with jam. It's all going to be running smoothly, because the AI has already figured out the paper share problem. Um, so yeah, there is a technology aspect of it, and there is the human component.
Yeah, what is interesting is, from my perspective, I see there is a lot of investment happening in the US in terms of building the infrastructure and being the infrastructure backbone for the world. But there is also a lot of need right now and drive to build, sovereign infrastructure in different regions. I think that we got to a point where we realized that AI and technology is not anymore nice to have and something that we would like to offer the opportunity to citizens to choose to go for it or not, which was the case before. Do we want to have, an Amazon? Do we want to have a Netflix? Maybe yes, maybe no. It's up to the citizens to decide. Therefore, we're not going to be building an Amazon or a Netflix in each one of the countries. But nowadays, what technology is bringing is a completely different way of working, doing the things that we generally do, interact socially, educate our children, operate at the government level. So therefore, there is a change in mindset, I think, where we cannot let this technology and innovation happen only in one place. It has to happen at the local level. And we need to build that capacity, the infrastructure, software components, all of the different elements to be able to build those systems, because it's so fundamentally changing everything that we do. Therefore, I feel like in the future, it's not going to be just in Silicon Valley that the systems are built, and not just in Silicon Valley that the systems are built for the rest of the world. It may be that every region will have to have their own capacity to build and drive innovation, not because we want to, but because we have to. And because there are specific fundamental differences between cultures that are now being brought into the systems that has to be respected. So I see this, like, for example, right now, we're just looking into some of the latest announcements from a company that has been created in Saudi Arabia that is really spearheading AI adoption, that is called Humane, created to really build innovative AI systems. And what they do is they are taking the best models and the best technology that exists around the world, but they are building it for Arabic first, or for Saudi first. Therefore, you can actually accurately create and represent the culture, the beliefs, the values of the people in this region, right? And I think there's a huge win for everybody, because eventually creates something that is really valuable for the local market, and it can really help us grow in the way we need to, rather than having to adopt something that was built someone else for a different audience, a different mindset, and having to find ways to just make sure that it's tailored to the specific market. And I have seen the same in Europe. There is all these AI factories that have been built to be able to build the local environments. UK is now creating their own microchip industry, and they have a lot of very powerful powerhouses for AI, like DeepMind and others. So, and we started to see kind of this kind of flourish and being invested and developed by different countries. So I think the future will look very differently, especially for innovation, than what we see today. I don't know what you think, right? Victoria, what is your thought about it?
I'm certainly excited about this. I actually believe that with innovation, so I believe that when the tide is rising, we're all lifting with the tide, right? So the tide lifts us all. So I'm very excited about those. There is obviously, this whole model that I'm preaching to the world is that you can learn from each other, right? So you can learn from Silicon Valley and implement it in your company. So we were talking about risk tolerance, for example. Obviously, the risk tolerance for the startup that has nothing to lose, if we saw in the video, is different from a risk tolerance from a corporation. But it doesn't mean that within the corporation you can't carve out a piece of it that actually goes and look at innovation and acts as a startup. Similarly on the regional level. So if there is an infrastructure that's built in one place, it doesn't mean that it cannot be built elsewhere. But there is certainly, from the innovation point of view, that openness of the ecosystem and collaboration and learning from different parts of it, cross-pollination from different industries, different expertise, different regions, that will actually enriches the effort on all sides. So that's from that perspective. I think it's very exciting, and artificial intelligence is a great trend, and we haven't even started to understand how it's going to impact it. Obviously, there are going to be, for me, I think that we all understand that there will be great benefits from that as well, from that proliferation of technology and the ease of use of the technology, and it will create so many opportunities over the world.
And I mean, what we're also looking at, obviously, all of us, as the rising competition between the U.S. and China. And maybe, the next Silicon Valley, will be in China. We don't know. So, because there are a lot of interesting things are happening, and obviously around AI, around DeepSeek, and the version of DeepSeek, that was meant, to topple OpenAI, was done in a very kind of Silicon Valley style, because it was a small team of developers that were doing it something on the side. It's just their brilliance allowed them, to develop a model, that was so much cheaper, so much more affordable, and take on the big guys. Because from their perspective, the Silicon Valley, OpenAI folks, or Meta folks, so they are the old world. And they came up with a product, that smelled like new world is coming. And it's quite possible, that in addition to the democratization of AI, we're also going to have the financial democratization. It means it's going to be increasingly affordable. And the way China has established itself in the global economy since the mid 1990s, and the mid 2000s, so that's their forte. They know how to do that. And I think, here, I mean, we are opening a little bit of a bigger conversation, and I don't want to kind of jam it at the end of our conversation about Silicon Valley. But I wanted to close on that note, to see we're looking into the future. So we looked at the history of Silicon Valley. So what defines it, some of the attempts to replicate it, its relationship with the global world, but tomorrow the world may be very different and there will be other players there. And that's what's exciting about it.
Yeah, and I think maybe just to complement what you just said, I have some material that we can go over maybe in the next episode, talking about the views from Kai Fu Lee and some other insights from his book, The AI Superpower, that we can bring in and complement what we just discussed here, and just see if, as you said, Silicon Valley in China is the next big thing or not. Quick question,
Right.
right?
Right. It may not happen next time because we have James Ehrlich coming next time, with smart cities. So, but we'll definitely pick up, the Silicon Valley, U.S. and China, have a conversation, the following episode. So we're looking at more like mid March for all the viewers and listeners to know. So I think exciting things are coming, but we want to change it a little bit, not to give people lecture after lecture on the same topic, but kind of switch over, talk about smart cities, that go back, to Silicon Valley with a new kind of Chinese angle. Yeah. Anyways.
Yes, and just to summarize a little bit, right? So we were talking about Silicon Valley's geography a lot, but we were also talking a lot about Silicon Valley's spirit, and that's totally different. So it's almost like any place from the spirit perspective, right? From that virtual Silicon Valley, any place, any geography, any company, any person can actually get, this best pieces of what we just discussed in Silicon Valley and adopt it as their tool set, their toolbox, right? Really get into that innovation and new ideas and that mentality of changing the world and bringing the best to the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great summary.
So, Victoria, if you were to close, because I think we are close to finishing our podcast, from a summary perspective, what are the 3 or 4 key things that makes that unique spirit for Silicon Valley that we should all strive to imitate or replicate in other regions?
I definitely say risk tolerance is one of those. So looking at unsuccessful attempts and failures as lessons and taking really in this as a data point. Be a bias toward action, I think, is a fantastic principle that a lot of people and a lot of companies can benefit from. Again, there is a balance that needs to be considered between jumping into action and analyzing, but that bias toward action, experiment, and learning from those data points and building that agile cycle, that's important as well. And then the last one is really just the spirit of innovation, right? So that drive to continuously produce new ideas and take them into the business and implement them and see them grow and see them impact the world in the fantastic ways that we can't even anticipate.
Excellent. Those are really good summaries. And I think one of the things we also mentioned was the ability to scale and understand what does it require to scale. So if you as an entrepreneur, as a CEO, realize that you're not able to grow with the company and the specific skill sets that you need to have, then you need to make sure you're ready to hand over the reins to others that can actually help you achieve that, right? So that's an interesting thing that maybe not everyone feels super comfortable, as they feel like this is my baby thing, and eventually from an idea become a real. I think I just want to be always at the forefront of what the company is doing. Interesting things related to the process of succeeding as an entrepreneur. But excellent summary. I love that.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Victoria. Fantastic appearance. You brought so much great energy and knowledge. And it's really good to have someone who has such an intimate knowledge of Silicon Valley, through the decades that you've lived and worked there. So I think we're about to close. Thank you, everybody, for listening. So we'll be back in 2 weeks, with a new episode. Be well, everybody. At the Constant.
Thank you.
Thank you.